Hello once again, everybody. We're back up and running here at the Jack Threlfall Show on this rainy Wednesday afternoon in the southeast of England. And we're talking the Miami Grand Prix. Heading into the round, all the pundits were saying, Perez had a real pace advantage on Verstappen in Azerbaijan. Can he carry it through to Miami or the distance of the season? May we really have a championship battle on our hands? It might have been track specific, but we might have some real substance here, some tension at the front of the field for the rest of the season. Obviously, they've got an incentive to sell that in their marketing, but it's what every fan is hoping for. Max is always better when he's pushed to his limit of performance. We saw it in 21, and everyone wants to see it again. As I said, single-digit points gap at the top. If we're getting an inter-team fight for the title, it's better than nothing. Also in the streets of Baku, we saw Leclerc's qualifying pace fully on show again. After a really weak start to the season for both him and that Ferrari team, it was a result they needed to walk away with the pole position and the P3 in the Grand Prix. Also, Fernando Alonso delivered a fourth consecutive 15-point scoring weekend if you combine the sprint and the Grand Prix result. Besides some woeful pit lane security management though, there wasn't so much to put in one of these debrief videos. I mean, Esteban Ocon nearly running over FIA's own scrutineers who were put in danger by the FIA's own security guards. It's an unsafe release if I've ever seen one, right? And not by the teams this time. As we saw also, Max and George threw some handbags after the sprint. It's always good for the Netflix cameras, but if you want a real fight after a race, you can watch NASCAR. Formula One is great for delivering on-track battles, and hopefully we get to see some more of those in the future, but I don't think anyone was too impressed by what we saw after the sprint. Speaking of NASCAR, here's some footage of one of their more polite post-race disputes that was settled at Kansas Speedway last weekend. But speaking of 1-2 combos, Baku is paired with Miami as the first doubleheader of the 2023 Formula One season, so it was off across the pond for the paddock for the second ever Crypto.com Miami Grand Prix, or Miami Gardens if we're being geographically accurate. It took place around the Dolphins NFL Stadium, and we could see from the sponsors, Saudi oil companies, offshore crypto exchanges, and vaping subsidiaries of tobacco giants. It's always great to see that F1 is making intelligent choices with its sponsors. Now, Miami was an odd one last year, and this year, that weirdness was really turned up to 11. In the US, their primary racing series of IndyCar and NASCAR, we get these introductions with epic military flyovers, anthems, orchestras, proper belters, everyone standing up, hands on their hearts and hats off while they praise the greatest nation in the world, at least for them. The calls of drivers, start your engines, echo through the stadium, and it's something that's built on a tradition of doing exactly that. So it's something that fans look forward to every year and has become a part of the spectacle. So you can see, at least to some extent, there was some justification for F1 trying to bring these kinds of things into Formula One. So the fanfare works sometimes, but at Formula One in Miami, it just kind of didn't. There's not really a precedent for those things in European motorsport in the exact way they're done in America. But things like the red arrows flying over Silverstone before the race add a huge amount of hype, and the driver's parade is something that I think really does add value as a general attendance fan ticket. There are things that Formula One does right, so it's important to not just disregard everything they tried. Unfortunately, that will.i.am Formula hype building intro track did sound like it was made by an AI on low battery mode. The grid walk was cool though, Martin Brundle and Sir Jackie Stewart cutting past security barriers and dragging Roger Federer onto TV for a last-minute interview. It's moments like that that still show that F1 knows sometimes how to produce an entertaining pre-race broadcast. That energy of live television, of random encounters, takes real skill to make work. Murray Walker perfected it before Martin, and it's a fantastic thing to keep that legacy going when it's done right. I mean, look, it's important to make the point that these things that F1 tried to do here were not fundamentally bad ideas. I mean, in the UFC, a big title fight there. You'll see the stadium blacked out, the hype building. It works, right? The first notes of Conor McGregor or Israel Adesanya or John Jones' walkout music. People recognise it, they connect it with the fighters, and the hype builds. Plus you've got Bruce Buffer, the veteran voice of the Octagon, belting out the intros. It works, right? It's something that they've built over time, they've tried and failed to develop over the years, and they've got to a point where they have a working style. So there's always going to be that process of development when we see it in Formula One. And it's sometimes tricky to, in the moment, appreciate that in the process, but lessons are learned, right, at every stage. And it's just like running a race team. There are going to be moments of trial and error there, and it's about how you respond to them. So hopefully we'll see some lessons learned on the broadcast side. So moving on from the pre-race theatrics, let's get on to what actually happened, right? Did it live up to the hype? Was the intro better or worse or equal to the race itself? Qualifying saw some unexpected drama with home hero Logan Sargent starting dead last in the race, no good for him. Both McLarens also out in Q1, but Nick De Vries surviving Q1. A decent result for him and maybe a confidence builder for someone who's really struggled in the start of the year. Lewis Hamilton, though, stuck down in P13, while Pierre Gasly and Kevin Magnussen not only made it through to Q3, but put in really impressive banker laps in those first runs. It was Perez, though, who took provisional pole after the first runs in Q3. Cut forward to Charles Leclerc pushing his red car to the absolute limit on the second runs and losing the rear through turn 7. Game over. As Martin Brundle would say, it was straight to the scene of the accident for the Monegasque driver. And I think this image here shows a really good comparison of the cause of that incident, or at least one of the causes, because we can look at the difference between the entry curb aggression of Sergio Perez versus Charles Leclerc, and you can see how hard Leclerc is having to try and push to make up for his lack of speed in the car, and then with him skidding off flying into the barrier, we see the consequences of sometimes going over that limit. Really tricky one. Charles knows that he has the talent and the speed and tries to push to the limit. We saw, again, at times like in Monaco, moments where you go over it on a street track are always going to be brutal. But Leclerc hits the wall, the red flag is out, no time to restart qualifying, we're done. Max Verstappen also made a mistake on his first run, not enough to send him into the barrier, but also not enough to set a competitive time. So with the red flag coming out at the end, he doesn't get to do another lap. He's starting 9th. When Sergio Perez has kept that provisional pole, he's going to be starting 1st. So suddenly this fight we're talking about earlier, it's advantage Perez. First, when your teammate's in 9th, you've got the motivation of the garage. The team expects you to win. If you think your equal drivers are even better than Max, you should be able to beat him if he's 9th and you're 1st, if you have a real chance, any chance, at the championship. So it was a good Saturday for one half of the Red Bull garage, but we've seen Max cut through the field before. Think Hungary, think Spa in 2020. So what all happened in the race then? Well, first and foremost, it was better than Baku, I think, on a kind of objective level of just the on-track action, the overtakes, the excitement, the tension throughout the race, particularly on the strategy basis. It was a one-stopper, but you did have split strategies with half on hards and roughly half on the mediums. You've got to take what you can get with this rule package, right? We've seen the overall level of overtaking, of the impact of dirty air kind of take a step backwards this year compared to last year, at least so far in the season, right? As the teams find more downforce in their development, we're back in this constant fight of regulators taking off downforce, the teams finding new ways to put it back on because they have more resources than the people setting the rules. It's an eternal problem in Formula One and probably worth its own video. But back to the race. So lap 1, we saw clean starts from the front runners, a unfortunately predictable mistake from Nick De Vries, who locked up and skidded into the back of Lando Norris's car. Max Verstappen had the difficult task of starting 9th and looking to stay out of any midfield lap 1 crashes and make overtakes before his teammate can speed off into the distance, all while also having to manage the heat of the hard tyre as the first of the front hard starters. He's really got to kind of work on his temperature, right? He's got a long way to go on these tyres, so he can't scrub them up, he can't lock up on the first lap because that's really going to compromise his strategy overall, and it'll allow Perez to go off into the distance if he does that. There were echoes of last year's Belgian Grand Prix as Max flowed through the field as he got the overtakes going. Lap 3, 4, DRS active, it's time to go forward. for Verstappen. He knows that he's got to make it count. And as we watched him move forward, it felt a lot more like a matter of when, not if he would reach the front. Piastri and Yuki Tsunoda also had flying first laps. You can check out the F1 top 10 onboard compilation for those. But they were pretty cool and often missed on the broadcast too, right? It's things that go down in the midfield never really make it to the broadcast. So do yourself a favour and check out some of those highlights if you really want to see what I mean when I talk about the quality of the overtaking action in Miami. Sergio Perez quickly pulled the gap on Fernando Alonso to over a second out of DRS range, securing clear air for himself both in front and behind. And it was a good sign for him, an improvement on Saudi Arabia where he had to fight with Alonso before he could achieve that and try and pull the gap on Max. Now, it worked better long term for Perez, in Saudi Arabia, obviously going on to eventually get the win there. But for the start, you can see that as an improvement, right? Pierre Gasly, as we mentioned earlier, he's starting nearer the front than normal. He held position well on the first lap, while Kevin Magnussen in fourth looked to really be struggling. Lance Stroll also had an issue in qualifying. He was starting down near the back, so the pressure was going to be on him. Since his teammate's so far forward, he's also going to be aggressive on lap one, and did exactly that. The next dramatic moment in the race was Max Verstappen's double move, where he took Charles Leclerc and Kevin Magnussen in one fell swoop of DRS on the pit straight. Nice and easy. Next was Russell, gone with no drama. Then Pierre Gasly the same. Ex-Red Bull teammates, of course, Verstappen and Gasly. Then by lap 10, Max only had the podium places in front of him. By lap 14, he's put Carlos Sainz in the rear view. It's just Fernando Alonso and the teammate to go. Meanwhile, ex-rival of Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, is still stuck down in 13th. Not ideal for him or the team when George Russell is looking to go forward in the race too. He would like a rear gunner in Lewis Hamilton to push the team forward for this kind of P2 fight that they're in with Aston Martin and Ferrari. Now, what helps Mercedes is that Lance Stroll is also back down that end of the grid. For Max, though, the robbery job was almost complete, right? He took P2 from Alonso on lap 15, and perhaps it was an even greater robbery job than the concession prices, which I'll have on screen now. Absolutely insane for the hospitality at the Monaco Grand Prix. Now, talking strategy, it was split, right, for the energy drink boys. It's an interesting one. Perez started on the mediums and would likely have been heavily disadvantaged on lap 1 if he'd opted to copy Max and go onto the hards, because he'd be battling with Fernando on the mediums, and we saw how Max struggled to fire up those tyres, right? So I don't think you can argue that Red Bull had preferred Max, right, or they knew that the strategy they'd given Max was the better one. I think what we really saw was Max, through his own skill and kind of repetitive consistency, tyre management and overtaking and just being efficient with the tyre deg, it was his own driving skill, right, that got him the win here. So, as I said, there was this balance with the strategy, and, there's a famous quote that says, if you split the strategies with your cars, you're guaranteeing that one of them will be wrong. Maybe that's what we saw play out in Miami, and Max was on the right side of the coin flip. If Perez did have pace on the hard, though, just like Max did in the first stint of the race, Perez did have the opportunity to show it. He could have made it a lot more challenging for Max. So I think you have to argue that it was just simply a pace advantage, not solely a strategy advantage, that put Max ahead in the race. As the laps ticked down, though, it became more and more evident that this was yet another Max Verstappen masterclass. The battle of the race was arguably between Magnussen and Leclerc. Again, you can go check that out in the onboard highlights video, but they duelled it out between the walls and provided some much needed action on track while we saw the strategy play out between the front cars. It's not that interesting to watch on TV. It's really just maths, right? And as nerdy as I am, even I can find that a little boring sometimes. Now, one thing we did see that was cool this year was some fast pit stops. 2 fast pit stops from 2 different teams. A 2.21 from Ferrari and a 2.27 from Jonathan Wheatley's Red Bull crew. Now, both of those are seriously impressive achievements and the fastest pit stops I believe we've seen of the year this far. I'll put up some graphics on screen now, hopefully, that either back up or contradicts what I'm saying. But it's a rare highlight, right, for Ferrari. They've got quite good at the pit stops now. They're consistently fast. They're consistently competing with Red Bull, who have long been at the front of that aspect of Formula One. So it's a rare thing for Ferrari where we can say, hey, look, these Ferrari guys, not only have they made an improvement, it's an improvement that's stuck, and it's one that we're seeing across tracks benefit their performance. So it's a rare highlight, right? And I think maybe one that, at least from what I could tell, has gone a bit missed in the media. But maybe it's because we're not seeing the Ferraris fight so far forward that it's making that much of a difference to the outcome. So when the strategies of the two Red Bulls finally synced up and the two engaged in battle on track, I do think you have to respect Sergio Perez for at least symbolically throwing out one block to the inside of Max Verstappen's car before Max sped past on the pit straight. They both broke very early into turn one as Max sealed off the move and effectively demonstrated both that they were kind of willing to fight each other, but they didn't want to provide any drama for the team. Any sense that they might touch was completely taken away by both drivers being heavily cautious. And I think Max knowing that there's absolutely no reason to try any kind of risky overtake when he doesn't need to, when he had time and tyres on his side. Now, luckily for Lewis Hamilton, Sir Lewis Hamilton, we should say, his pace improved dramatically during the kind of middle and final stints. And it was to such an extent that he threw a lovely dive bomb in the end of the race on Charles Leclerc for P6 and got a well-earned cheer from the crowd. Meanwhile, home favourite Logan Sargent had just about the worst race possible, starting and finishing in P20. Not a weekend to forget, though, in many ways, because as Giannis, the basketball player, I'm not going to try that surname because it's pretty brutal, but a legendary guy, obviously MVP in the NBA Finals winner, he said in a press conference, I think a couple of weeks ago now, that there are no mistakes in sport, right? Only lessons. And this was something that was picked up by Lewis, and Lewis had kind of talked about it in the press conferences as like a really good thing to live by when you're an athlete. So for Logan Sargent, no mistakes, only lessons. And hopefully he can learn them as the season ticks down. He's got 2 more Grand Prix in the USA to get cheered on by the crowd in, so maybe he can deliver there. Yuki Tsunoda, most underrated driver, I think, so far this year. He fought valiantly in what is definitely the worst car on the grid, technically, to a frustrating and pointless but symbolically significant P11. As I said, the worst car on the grid, you can think back to the sort of George Russell Williams drives where we know how hard it was for him to even get close to the points in that car. And I think you've got a similar thing playing out with the AlphaTauris this year. It just doesn't seem like that team's in the best place technically. And right, it's, there's always going to be a loser in Formula One. And I think what was rare this race as well, again, this is a time for me to throw some stuff on the screen, was no yellow flags, no VSCs, no safety cars, nothing in the entire race distance. No mechanical failures. There probably were slight mechanical faults, of course. There always are little things wrong with the cars that can hold back their pace, but no DNFs for the entire race distance, which is really, really rare. Particularly on a street track, right? No one ended up in the barriers in the race. Of course, we did see Leclerc have a big one in qualifying, so you can't say it was a perfect weekend overall. Going back to Yuki Tsunoda, I think there's a really good comparison to be made between the Russell years, right? Because we're seeing his teammate struggle quite heavily and Yuki have to take the responsibility of a team leader. And it's going to be good to see, I think, also how that plays out for him, whether it's going to make him faster, whether he can, like Bottas is mentoring Zhou, whether he can bring De Vries up to at least his pace through sharing data, through collaboration inside the team. Something that you really need when you're not in a fast car is for both people to work together and to help each other, right? And also to be fast enough to have the opportunity to help each other. So Max Verstappen's got the lead. Fernando Alonso's got no one near him. The checkered flag flies. Race is over. Here is your final running order and your race distances. You'll be able to read all those on screen now as I read off my notes. It was a decent result for the Alpines, both in the points. Their CEO had a very tough assessment of them in the press. He was calling, trajectory's terrible, the leadership's crap. And it's like, mate, who do you think put this team together, right? Like, I don't think he's quite understood the power of his words and how self-deprecating they were, I suppose. So yeah, both Alpines in the points after a tricky week in the press. Of course, great for the Red Bulls, their 4th 1-2 result in the first 5 races of the year. I mean, this is more than the Mercedes, right? Maybe the Mercedes in 16 was their most dominant year. I think people often forget that like 17 and 18, Ferrari was leading the Drivers' Championship at the halfway points in both those seasons, but in 16 particularly was probably definitely Mercedes' most dominant year. And that's what we're seeing get rivaled by Red Bull this year. If this pattern keeps going, they might, as George Russell said, they might win every single race unless they hit each other or they have some big mechanical failure. Again, Fernando Alonso, solid P3, both in the race and the championship. He didn't have anyone too near him for that position. Amazing for Aston Martin. Probably that's what's fueling the rage of the Alpine CEO, right? Watching Aston Martin make such a jump in performance. But unfortunately for Alpine, if you're going to get those positions nearer the front of the championship, you have to either be in front of the Mercedes, the Astons, or the Ferraris. And those teams, while Red Bull are making them look a bit silly at the top end, they're still very high-performing organisations, and they're not going to be easy to beat. You're going to have to move all of them out of the way, Mr. Laurent Rossi, and I'm just not sure they're going to be able to do that anytime soon. So we'll switch over now from the race results to the championship order. The best graphic in the world, the Wikipedia colour-coded Formula One World Championship table. So first, the drivers. You'll see Lewis Hamilton ahead of George Russell and both the Ferraris. That's very impressive for him. Very much recovering from what was one of Lewis's weakest seasons in Formula One last year. To be ahead of Russell is good. Of course, there is a mechanical DNF for Russell in there, which maybe we'll see swing the other way later on in the year. But Lewis beating George and both the Ferraris, as I said, the gap between Alonso and Stroll is echoing the Norris and Ricciardo situation. Nico Hülkenberg with a solid start to the year, beating his teammate in the Haas. What else can we see? I mean, it's really super, super tight in that midfield, right? The gaps between the positions are tiny compared to what we're seeing at the front of the field. So one solid weekend, just like the Alpines had in Miami, can really shuffle that up a bit, right? Which is a good thing. It's super, super tight in Formula 1.5, even if it's not so good in Formula 1. Alpines, particularly their points totals for their drivers, were massively held back by that big crash in Australia. So let's switch over now to the Constructors' World Championship table. Again, the wonderful Wikipedia colour-coded World Championship table. Red Bull a mile away at the front with over double the points of Aston Martin. I mean, you know, it's incredible, right? The level of performance that team is operating at with the car, with the race team, with the drivers. I mean, they could take 2-3 rounds off and they'll still win the title. Maybe they need to. If they're over the cost cap, just sack it off for a few weekends. You'll probably still win. Ferrari, they've got some real distance to make up before they can join the party. Aston Martin, as I said, Fernando Alonso delivering most of the points there, but they're ahead still of Mercedes, who of course supply a lot of parts for their car, the gearbox, the engine, the rear suspension. I mean, beating the factory team with their own parts is something we see a bit more often maybe in MotoGP, but it's cool to see. And really impressive, right? Really rewarding, I'm sure, for everyone at Aston Martin. From fifth down then in the championship table for the Constructors, it's really anyone's guess. Positions will inevitably change a lot as we move between the various tracks with high downforce, low downforce. Wet and dry races, of course, will play a role. The various specialities of each's, sacrifices and advantages, disadvantages of their car will flow and shuffle around between rounds. But luckily it is close. So we know, at least in this point in the season, there's a lot of potential for teams to either over or underperform week in and week out, right? Maybe that's just a kind of punditry platitude there, but it should be exciting. Haas would probably take 7th at the end of the year. Williams need to get their rookie to develop a little faster than AlphaTauris if they're looking to win that battle. Maybe they've got equal cars, maybe the Williams is a little bit better, but they have similar-ish situations, right? They've got, they've both got Red Bull Juniors as their kind of team leaders and then rookies as their other driver, so they're in quite direct competition. Alfa Romeo then kind of stuck in no man's land in the middle. Bottas, of course, as we said earlier, a good team leader, and as good really as any of the non-World Championship drivers on the grid. Well then, looking forward now, we've reflected on the championship tables to the European swing of the season. Imola, Spain, Monaco, interrupted temporarily by Montreal, and then we get kind of back into that Silverstone, Spa, Italy swing of things. Really, really epic tracks, high quality race tracks, not like the Miami Gardens circuit. I don't think we'll ever see that points gap at the top of the table get back down into the single digits, but we might if a mechanical DNF can screw over Max, or maybe Sergio Perez's dad with the sniper rifle in the grandstands. For now, though, Thank you very much for watching. I'll be back soon, and we're out of time.